Once upon a time, in a small village, there lived an old man named Mr. McCrank. Everyone called him Old Meany McCrank because he was so hateful and mean. The family who lived next door to him became so distressed with his grumbling and fighting that they finally sold their home and moved away. The Lovett family, who bought their house, did not know they were moving next door to such a mean neighbor. As soon as they started moving in, however, they began to hear about Old Meany McCrank. The nearby neighbors said,
"We hope he don't make you as miserable as the people who moved away."
Well, family, I want all of us to be kind and loving to Mrs. McCrank, no matter what he does. We all agree with that.
The first thing Mrs. Lovett did to show friendliness was to take Mr. McCrank a plate of freshly baked walnut cookies.
Walnut cookies, I can't eat walnut cookies. Think about that.
Undaunted, she went home and baked some plain sugar cookies for him. But as Mrs. Lovett walked back to her house, he watched her silently from his window. The next morning, Mr. Lovett took a stroll to look over their yard. As he stood admiring a large apple tree growing by their fence, he heard someone digging on the other side. It was Mr. McCrank working in his flower bed.
Good morning, Mr. McCrank.
Oh, good morning all. Your big old apple tree casting shade all over my flower beds. I'm the last chef's nice flock.
He continued weeding with a scowl on his face. Several days later, one of the Lovett boys was batting balls in their yard. Suddenly, his ball went astray, flying high toward Mr. McCrank's house. Crash! It busted through his kitchen window.
Oh, we're terribly sorry. We'll please glass as soon as possible.
You better, woman.
The next day, they replaced the glass, but the new glass shone so brightly that it made all the other window glass look dull. So the Lovetts brought over a bucket of sudsy water and washed all the other windows. Mr. McCrank stood by the door, silently watching as his new neighbors washed all his windows. That night, a blustery wind blew that night. When morning came, Mr. McCrank knocked furiously on the Lovetts' door.
Look at my yard. Leaves and tree are blowing all over. If you look out there right now, you and your kids can clean it up, put your garbage over, and dump every last piece by piece, across your yard.
The Lovett children hurried to get their jackets. They started raking leaves as fast as they could. When the leaves were all raked up, Father Lovett noticed that the grass needed mowing. He brought over his lawnmower and mowed the entire lawn. Mr. McCrank watched silently from his window as his new neighbors mowed his lawn. One day, Mrs. Lovett noticed the village doctor entering Mr. McCrank's house. As the doctor was leaving, she approached him.
Is there anything we can do to help Mr. McCrank? Can you give medicine or take him to?
Of course, that'd be fine. But remember, he can only drop medicine and raw for the next 5 days.
Chicken soup come right up.
So, for the next 5 days, one of the Lovetts took Mr. McCrank a kettle of steaming broth and a bowl of gelatin. Mr. McCrank accepted the food without a word, but each day as they left the house, he eyed them curiously from his bedroom window. This Lovett family puzzled him greatly. By Sunday, Mr. McCrank was feeling fine. He sat by his window and watched the Lovetts as they walked happily toward their little corner church. All that day, Mr. McCrank thought about the Lovett family.
Why do they treat me so nice? Why do they come in with me whenever I do? Surely something's got to make them lose their patience. I'll give it one final test. I'll see exactly how lovely they really are.
And he gazed toward the fence where the Lovetts' big apple tree was casting shade on his flower garden.
That's it. I've chopped down their apple tree.
That night, Mr. McCrank crept out of his house with a hatchet in his hand. He chopped, and he chopped, and he chopped. Finally, the Lovetts' beautiful apple tree toppled to the ground. When the Lovetts looked out the window the next morning, They were horrified to discover their apple tree was laying on the ground, its boughs still loaded with red apples.
Now, he was wrong with Mr. McCrank to chop down our apple tree. He had no right to destroy what belonged to us. We have always shown him a kind, loving, forgiving spirit. So let's do that right now. Go quickly, take the apples off the tree and make a nice apple for Mr. McCrank. Also bring something, I'll make an apple pie and take it to him. And make sure when you give it to him, to greet him with a smile.
Several hours later, when Mr. McCrank opened his door, he could not believe his eyes. The Levette children were standing there smiling up at him. One child handed him a warm apple pie. It smelled delicious. Another handed him a basket of shiny red apples. He stood there stunned and speechless. Several days passed by without any sign of Mr. McCrank. Then one morning, the Levettes heard a knock on their door.
What was your name?
Sorry for the way I treated you guys. Sorry for cutting you out. I decided I want to be fast like you folks. Not to go to church next Sunday for taking.
Mr. McCrank, we're very sorry about that. We'd be glad to forgive you. And we would love you to come to church.
So, Mr. McCrank began regularly attending church services with the Levettes by the corner church. Later, he became a Christian, and from that day forward, Mr. McCrank was a new man. He started treating everyone in the village with kindness, and he even bought the Levette family a new apple tree.
Well, isn't it easy when other people are mean to us to treat them meanly back? And it's something that I still struggle with. And I remember when I was younger, whenever someone said something nasty to me or took away a toy, I just wanted to do the same thing back, only worse.